Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to get something lovely and warm and comforting to drink, and I'm so glad you've joined me tonight for a fabulous story, because you're really going to enjoy this story. There's nothing that beats a good old story, especially on a cold winter night, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I've always had issues in my life, big issues. That's what you can expect growing up in a fatherless home, with a mother who is so shut down emotionally that it's a miracle if she merely patted you on the back to acknowledge you. I do not remember my mother ever touching me when I was little, unless she had to put my hair up in a ponytail, or measure me for a dress fitting. Don't get me wrong, she gave us all we ever needed. Food, clothes, a roof over our heads, and even hired a babysitter from time to time when the need arose. But involved in our lives, she most certainly was not. It was hardly a wonder that as a little girl, I'd do almost anything to get my mother's attention. I even burnt down my mother's yard shed once, just so that she might notice me, and in the process nearly burnt down the entire house. Let's just say I was rewarded by a bad scolding. But that was so much better than not being noticed at all. My mother ghosted me and my brother William in our lives. She lived her life as if we didn't exist, as if we were apparitions in the attic that sometimes went bump in the night, that she found incredibly annoying. My mother would spend hours a day in her private office, where she had rows upon rows of books all on ancient Egypt, which she would study for hours and hours on end, making long cryptic notes. At the time, I had no idea why my mother was so fascinated by Egyptology. She had an unquenchable thirst when it came to the subject. She'd often take trips to Egypt, and when she came back from those pampered indulgences, she seemed like a much nicer person, but her good mood never really lasted. On most days of the week, she was like a dark storm cloud hovering over the horizon, not friendly, not approachable, and always intimidating. I remember one day I had been snooping around in her study when she was out, as my mother failed to lock the door, and this was the quintessential opportunity for me to have a great snoop. I was desirous to know what kept her so busy for hours a day. Her study was a treasure trove of stuff she'd brought in Egypt, from ancient pieces of pottery and other interesting artifacts. There were bookshelves overflowing with information on the pharaohs, a sprawling collection of Egyptian art on the wall. To say she was obsessed with ancient Egypt was an understatement. I almost jumped out of my skin when my mother entered the study, wearing a foreboding thunderstorm on her face and oscillating her arms around indignantly like the tentacles of a speared octopus. I was so scared by her thunderous demeanour that I could feel a warm liquid trickling down my legs. I'd wet myself. I perceived I was in big trouble, and in that moment I was scared of her. When my mother grew capriciously angry, it would literally turn me into a useless lump of wobbly jelly, like a great big Portuguese man of war. My mother had always insisted that we were never ever allowed to go into her study. I had broken the cardinal rule, and I was in big trouble. "What are you doing, Harper? Snooping around in my study? How dare you? You know the rules in this household. The study is out of bounds for you kids." "I'm sorry, Mummy," I said obsequiously. "The door was open. You usually lock it." That was when my mother's dark eyes scanned the picture in the open book in my hands. It was a picture of a striking Egyptian princess, and that was the only time I ever saw my mother smile. "That picture you're looking at, Harper, does she remind you of anyone?" she asked me. "What, this?" I asked incredulously, looking down at the picture in my hands. "No, I don't think so. No one I know looks like this. Should it remind me of someone?" My mother had visibly frowned. "Can't you see the resemblance in the profile? That was me in one of my lifetimes. I was an Egyptian princess. I can remember my life back then in vivid detail. Life was so much more sophisticated in those days. So much so than our lives now. Much more colourful and vibrant. So can't you see that was me? She asked, sounding disappointed. I then realised, to curry favour with my mother, I should tell her exactly what she wanted to hear. You know what, Mum? I think it does actually look like you, I told her. My mother removed the book from my hands and studied the picture of the Egyptian princess, staring at it wistfully, with a nostalgic longing on her face. Oh, I was such a stunner back then, she said, smiling, as if reminiscing on a blissful memory. Why I ended up in this mundane lifetime after living such a gilded life before, God only knows, she said begrudgingly. Back then I was someone powerful, very important, of great influence. I remember wondering if my mother was as nutty as a fruitcake. How could she believe she was an Egyptian princess in a previous life? I decided that for my mother it was surely fanciful dreaming, musing over a life that she wished she'd lived. But I will admit, she did have an extraordinary conviction that never diminished throughout her lifetime. It was like she was living her life vicariously through an Egyptian princess, long since deceased, with an attachment that I considered most unhealthy. I grew up from a capriciously belligerent child into a difficult, tumultuous teenager, predisposed to temper tantrums, hissy fits, and throwing things around for dramatic effect, in order to procure my mother's undivided attention. I exhibited such unsavoury behaviour, as I desperately wanted my mother to notice me, but nothing I ever did helped, not even the negative school reports that tirelessly complained about my abysmal behaviour at school, and threatened that if I didn't pull my socks up, I might be kicked out of school for good. My mother never even reacted. She merely just said, "You kids, you honestly make me so sick. You're such spoiled brats, so self-entitled. I can't bear it, and I can't wait for you to leave home, so I can finally wash my hands of the both of you, once and for all." I often wondered why she was so disconnected and attached towards her own children. I could never figure it out. Did she hate children, I would wonder? She was the direct antithesis to the mothers that came to the school gate to collect their kids, that painstakingly packed their kids' school lunches for them in neat Tupperware containers, and were sure to bake cakes for their school fetes or come and watch their kids in a school play or sports event. Mothers that would embrace their children with big warm hugs, wiping tears away from their children's cheeks after their child took a nasty tumble down a flight of stairs and grazed their knees. My mother did none of those things, apart from begrudgingly picking us up after school. She'd never ask us about our day or what we wanted for lunch when we returned home. She would prepare lunch for us, do the things that mothers are supposed to do, but she never engaged with us or exhibited feelings of tenderness or love towards us. I would say she tolerated us, like you might tolerate the leak in your roof as best as you can, and manoeuvre your way around the problem. We were the problem in my mother's life, the thorn in her side. My mother was a closed book as far as her own childhood was concerned. We knew nothing about her early life. There were no photograph albums of her as a young girl. We had no memory of our father, and if we asked my mother about him, it would be like putting a cut finger in a fish tank full of piranhas, as she'd snap at you and almost eat you alive. "I beg your pardon," she'd say, putting her hands defiantly on her slender hips and staring at us contemptuously through her dark, flinty eyes. "How dare you ask me about my private life? It's none of your business. Do you hear me?" "But, Mum," my brother William would say, "don't you think we have a right to know who our father was?" "You have no right, William, to ask me anything that is not your business. Do you understand?" "But—" "No buts, William," she would say. To look at my mother was very prim and proper. Some people might have described her as a handsome woman. But attractiveness does tend to dissipate, like the steam from a kettle, on a face that wears their smile upside down. She wore tight, well-fitting clothes, in subdued, dull, depressing colours, that were as buttoned up and as unyielding as she was. Her clothes reflected a woman that was quite frosty and standoffish. I always noticed that the mothers that wore the colourful, loose, free-flowing clothes at the school gate were the most easy-going and fun-loving of them all. as if their relaxed clothes somehow reflected their mellow approach to life, like the spiritual gurus you see online, who always wear loose cotton shirts. My mother looked on such women with a contemptuous disregard. Many who reached out to her kindly, inviting her to coffee or lunch or to join the book club. "Oh, it's wonderful to see you, Hilda," one of the mothers called Mrs. Carter Price would say. "Why don't you join our book club? We could rarely do with your presence." My mother would scowl and say, "That won't be necessary, thank you very much, Mrs. Carter Price, but I'm not interested in reading fictional books. I've got so much better things to do with my time." "Oh, but that is a bit of a pity, isn't it? I mean, even if you're not interested in books, that's not a problem for any of us. But it's a lovely excuse for the mothers to get together, to have a good tete-a-tete, if you know what I mean." "I'm not interested in wasting my time on trivial gossip," my mother would snap. So from thenceforth the mothers regarded her from a safe distance, as if she was a dangerous, untamed dog that you needed to be wary about. It was not uncommon for the kids in my class at school to tell me how peculiarly eccentric my mother was. Kids can be brutally honest to the point of causing offence. "My mummy says your mum is really weird," they'd tell me. I never took offence to their deriding comments, because I knew they were true. If that wasn't bad enough, my mother's appearance didn't do her any favours in subduing her formidable reputation. She wore her hair in a stiff bun, without a hair out of place. Her golden-coloured skin was always devoid of makeup. Lips were like a dash across her face, that always was turned upside down into a frown. And she always wore stiff clothes. For some she looked like a modern-day Cruella de Vil, but she wasn't as cruel as a fictional character with 101 Dalmatians. She was indifferent, but some might say that indifference is cruel, and they might be right about that. When my mother died after a long battle with cancer, that she also concealed from us like she did everything else in her entire life, I hasten to say me and my brother never shed a tear when she died. It was hard to grieve a woman who had never shown any personal interest in us. My brother took the urn of her ashes and threw them into the dustbin. "She didn't give a damn about us," he told me. "Why should we give a damn about her?" I knew he was right to be angry, but throwing her urn in the dustbin seemed cruel. So when his back was turned, I removed it. I kept the ashes and took a trip to Egypt when I got the opportunity, throwing her ashes over the Nile River. I knew she'd have appreciated that. Needless to say, as a result of my tumultuous, rather difficult childhood, I was a troubled adult, getting into relationships where I was treated with the same measure of insouciance that my mother had shown me as a young girl. It would seem I was attracting the very people in my life that reflected my mother's apathetic impassiveness and detachment. I was drawn to men who didn't give a damn about me, and treated me with an aloof disdain and incurious complacency. Yet like a common garden bird, returning to eat the crumbs in the yard day after day, I'd keep going back for more and more. I was a glutton for punishment. My sapient brother William, on the other hand, was sagaciously reluctant to get involved in any serious relationships. He was terrified he'd find himself married to someone as callously insensitive or inattentive as my mother had been, and that was a real possibility. We are always drawn to what we are most familiar with, and me and my brother were like damaged goods, attracting into our lives the people we didn't want, like moths to a bright light. I was soon to find myself caught up in a pernicious relationship with a man called Bruce Knox, who would lock himself away in his study for ages, much like my mother had done, who would come up only for air like a seal under a frozen lake when he decided he was hungry. He ignored me and spoke badly to me, his words abrupt and unkind. And yet I put up with him because of my childhood. I had been treated by my mother with inertia. I didn't know any different. What was I doing with him, I wondered? Why was I hanging around with someone whose insouciant words were cruel and at the very least unkind? It was like I was standing in shark-infested water with the malevolent ocean monsters swimming around me, and I wasn't getting out of the water when I needed to get out of it fast, unless I wanted to be eaten alive by this man, who'd likely swallow up all my self-esteem, so that all that was left of me was a withering wreck of a woman. Did I really want that for my life? If I wanted a fighting chance to make a life for myself, I needed to change the interminable habits of a lifetime, change my environment, get the hell away from Bruce Knox. And one day, I courageously did just that. I took a Greyhound bus from Ohio to Virginia and found a job in a local town, working as a waitress. And that was when I met the love of my life, Jackson Gosling. The first time I laid eyes on Jackson Gosling, there was an immediate spark between us that I could not personally ignore. He was so different to all the other men I'd ever met. Jackson was genuinely kind, a quality I was not acquainted with in men I used to date. "Who is he?" I asked Winfred, the waitress who worked with me in the diner. "Oh, that's Jackson Gosling. He's a very good man. 3 years ago he lost his wife to peanut allergy. He's never been able to get over her passing. She was 6 months pregnant at the time, can you believe it? So he lost his wife and his child. He's a successful rancher, a beef farmer with a heart of gold. Everyone loves him in town. But don't even think about getting a date out of him. He won't be interested. He'll never ever get over Melanie. She was the love of his life. They were high school sweethearts, you know, been together since they were 15. If he could lie on her grave day and night like a dog that has lost his beloved master, he'd do just that. But he can't, because he's also devoted to running his ranch. He cares about those steers of his like they're his own children, you know." I could see the lonely, forsaken man staring out into space, looking so lost. I did something I've never done before. I gave him my phone number. "I just thought you might fancy a drink with me sometime," I said, giving him a large smile. "I heard about your wife and unborn baby. I'm sorry. If you want to talk about it, give me a call sometime. I'm a good listener." I thought I'd blown it when he crumpled up my phone number in his pocket and grunted. "I'll have the bill, if I may," he said gingerly. I handed him the bill. He tossed some notes on the plate and then marched out of the diner, replacing his cowboy hat on his head. And I knew I must have hit a raw nerve. Why did I even mention his wife and unborn child? The words had tumbled spontaneously out of my mouth before I had a chance to rein them in. "What did you do?" Winfred asked me. "I've never seen Jackson look so ruffled. What on earth did you say to him?" I gave him my phone number. I told him I was sorry about his wife and unborn child. "You did what?" "I warned you," she said incredulously. "The man is grieving. How could you be so presumptuous? He'd never be interested in you. It's not personal. He's totally in love with his wife." "But I like him. I couldn't help myself," I told her. Winfred smirked. "If I had a penny for every girl that told me that they liked Jackson, I'd be a very rich girl indeed. He's the kind of man every woman would want to marry. You'd know he would be devoted to you. He's incredibly loyal, and these days that's a rare quality to find in a spouse. But I doubt the poor man will ever marry again. He'll never get over Melanie." That evening I returned to my insalubrious, rather dingy apartment in town, situated over a 7-Eleven store at the time, that overlooked the views of the street, adjacent to a long ribbon of local shops. The shabby, rather down-at-heel apartment was owned by a woman I secretly called the old hag, because she looked just like one. She had a gnarled, crooked body, with twig-like fingers, and a long curtain of grey hair, with a beak-like nose. It didn't help she always wore black, because I could imagine her riding her broomstick in the dead of night. I was to learn that many locals called her the witch. Suffice to say, the ramshackle apartment was in a dreadfully neglected state, with very dodgy-looking electric connections, and with barely enough space to swing a cat. The carpet on the floor was pitifully threadbare, the dingy kitchen as tiny as a closet. The furniture was so grubby. It looked as if it had been recovered from the rubbish dump, and as if the fabric had been covered with oily pizza stains. But it was all I could afford at the time, and the worst part of it all was that there was mould growing on one of the walls. It made the entire apartment smell damp. That evening I remember opening a can of tuna fish and toasting a slice of bread, when my cell phone rang. There was no name on the caller ID, as I had less than half a handful of acquaintances in town that I knew, so I had no idea who was actually calling me. "Hello," I answered. "Hello," came Jackson's voice. "I got your number. You gave it to me in the diner in town today.
I think I'll take you up on your very generous offer. I wouldn't mind a nice chat. Maybe we could go for a drink somewhere together. Meet me at my apartment. I live in the flat above the 7-Eleven. When I opened the door to Jackson and he entered my apartment, he was taken aback. You live here? This place is terribly poky. You can't live here. Move into my farmhouse with me. You can stay in the spare room there until you find somewhere better for yourself. Look at these dreadful electric connections. You could be electrocuted by one of these things. This is really crazy. He was terribly concerned and mortified that I was living in such an unsightly apartment.
I don't think I could afford to live at your farmhouse. I mean, how much rent would you charge me?
Did I say anything about rent? As I said, you can stay there for as long as you need, until you find yourself a better place and finally get back on your feet. But this place is not fit for anyone to live in. I would feel very aggrieved if you stayed here.
I hasten to say I moved into Jackson's ranch, which is situated not far from the Shenandoah National Park in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I graduated from the spare room to his bedroom rather quickly, so our whirlwind romance meant that within a month he'd made an honest woman of me. We got married, much to the amazement of everyone in town, who could not believe I had snagged the unsnaggable man who had been hanging on to the leftover memories of his lost love and had no space for another woman. But they had been proved wrong. I knew I could never replace Melanie, but I was still the closest love he'd ever have. We had fallen in love with each other against all the odds, and when he learnt I was pregnant shortly after we were married, he was over the moon. But when I went to have a pregnancy scan, I discovered I'd already been 3 weeks pregnant before I met Jackson, with Bruce Knox's baby. I was devastated that the baby was not Jackson's. I didn't have the heart to tell him the sorry news. I didn't want to subject him to any more heartbreak than he'd already been through. I reasoned with myself that it wouldn't do him any harm not knowing the truth. He would still be a father to our child in every sense of the word, and blood wasn't everything. Jackson was reticent by nature, naturally reserved, but with me he was able to open up, and the romance between us blossomed. We were good for each other. I loved Jackson's farmhouse. It had a warm, cosy feeling about it, as Melanie's feminine influences over the place meant the rooms were sumptuously decorated in cosy furnishings, and the kitchen was refurbished with state-of-the-art fixtures and fittings suitable for any aspiring domestic goddess. The old colonial house was in remarkably good condition. It had been renovated over the years and looked as pretty as a picture, with fabulous prepossessing views of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by rolling hills of luxuriant green pastures, where my husband's steers would happily graze. I would watch Jackson riding on the back of one of his black horses, under a blue sky, with all the steers running ahead of him, and his 2 ebullient bouncy black Labradors on either side of the horse. It was like watching something out of an old country and western movie. It was poetry in motion, as Jackson was so graceful on the back of his horse. I'd never seen anyone as devoted to his animals as Jackson was to his steers, to his dogs and horses. I always worried about the day that those steers would be turned into beef. But Jackson was much more resilient than I gave him credit for. "They always say you shouldn't grow attached to your steers," he would tell me, "but I can't help myself. It's hard not to grow fond of them," he would tell me very proudly. One of my favourite go-to places was the extensive wood grove to the rear of our property. It branched out into another neighbour's ranch. I'd never lived in a place with such an abundance of land, but for me escaping to the wood grove was therapeutic to my soul. It made me forget about my turbulent past and focus on the bright future that lay ahead of me, like a great big warm welcome hug. My ever-expanding belly perpetually reminded me that there was a little one on the way, and no one loved my bump more than Jackson did. One day I decided to take a comfortable stroll in the wood grove. It was a magnificently beautiful day, with the sun gently filtering through the trees. It was cool in the forest, as the leafy canopy above my head sheltered me from the blazing sun. When you're carrying the extra weight of a baby, you are not thankful to hot weather, so the shade that the forest offered me I was very grateful for.
The prepossessing floor was teeming with an abundance of plant life, from funguses, ferns, resplendent mosses, and pretty shade-loving flowers. I could smell moss, wild flowers, intermingled with earthen smells, and hear the sound of water thundering across the rocks from the stream that ran through the woodgrove, as well as the bird song that trilled in the trees, that filled the forest with an orchestra of pretty music, from chirps to whistles and warbles. I was so enchanted by my surroundings that I sat down on a large fallen log, covered with a thick layer of verdant moss. In a trice I got the profound sense I was not alone. Something or someone was watching me, but who? I had seen squirrels, chipmunks, and even rabbits this morning crossing my path, but this was different. I could feel the prickles rising up on the back of my neck. That was when I saw this face peering out at me from behind a tree. At first I thought I'd imagined it. Was it a trick of the light, I wondered? But the second time I was in no doubt that something was watching me. I thought it was a human being, as the face was so human-looking. In truth, I thought it might be the neighbour's kids playing a trick on me. Jackson had warned me that they were mischief-makers, and sometimes ventured onto his side of the land, through the extended woodgrove, which both ranchers seemed to share as an unspoken agreement. "I saw you!" I cried out. "I saw you!" I ran over to what I believed was a mischievous child playing games with me, but this was no child. I was standing yards away from what I know was a female Bigfoot. I was so confounded that I stood there like a frozen statue, staring at her nonplussed, as if she was something that my mind had actually made up, fictitiously if you like. She wasn't real, I told myself, but I knew she was. For a moment we stared at each other. I wasn't scared of her. I possibly should have been given her Herculean size, her burly proportions, and her towering height. But when you've been thrown from the world you currently occupy into something so incongruously bizarre that doesn't fit your current perception of reality, fear is not something that immediately engages your attention, as you're trying to make sense of what you're seeing. The Bigfoot seemed amused by my shocked reaction, and I heard the words in my head. "I'm real. I'm not a figment of your imagination." I looked up at her in astonishment. Had the creature just spoken to me? But how can you communicate without audible words? As if understanding the conundrum of my perplexity, she spoke audibly, but in a language I did not understand. But as outlandish as this may sound, the meaning of her words was promptly revealed to my mind. In some form of telepathic exchange, she was pointing to my belly, and then to hers. That was when I realized she had a bump, much like my own. "Kitati lokoto, hati la niki, hapoko la kita, safakashanaki la kanoko, hadila golabokosha, silani kanisu." "Your little boy wants to be born," she told me, "but he's still got a while to wait. I'm also pregnant, but my baby's younger than yours. She's not as eager to be born. She likes the safe confines of my womb." I don't know how it happened, but we both began touching each other's bellies. The Bigfoot's brown eyes were filled with excitement. I think that is why she revealed herself to me. We were two mothers, both incredibly delighted about being pregnant, sharing in the magic of such a precious God-given gift together. "Dila Niko, ha sila tuasika, ho kolopoto, sinatale kanoko, hamasi." "It's been such a struggle getting pregnant," she told me, "but finally it's happened. And we're both soon to be mothers. I can't wait." "How do you know my baby's a boy?" I asked her. "Well, I can see the male energy flowing from you," she told me. "Itani kolaboko." I then heard the sound of an owl hoot. She stood up and tapped my back. "Ilaki loko, hasikatinako, homakila koshono, zavikila sinotoba, agila nokoloko shakwa, hisina tilanobo." "I need to go. That's my man. He can't bear to let me out of his sight after all the struggles I've been through to get pregnant. He likes to watch me like a hawk." Everything about her was so human, including the way she spoke about herself. I stood there in awe as she hooted back to her partner and gave me a brief nod, and then she disappeared into the woodgrove,
moving away so gracefully, as if she was floating on air. My encounter with her had been so brief, and had warmed the cockles of my heart, and was one of the best and most exciting things that has ever happened in my life. She told me I was having a boy. I hadn't even been informed of the sex of my child yet. Could she be right? Was I having a boy? It was later confirmed she was absolutely right about that. When I returned back to the house, I was eager to tell Jackson about my incredulous encounter, but something stopped me from opening up about the idiosyncratic turn of events that had dappled my day in a glaze of awesome golden wonder, and left me believing that the world was a much more exciting place than I had first envisaged. Whether Jackson would have believed my strange account was highly questionable, I thought, for I knew many believed that Bigfoot was a spurious creature of fiction and didn't actually exist here in North America, but I knew very different. One morning when Jackson came downstairs, he barged past me obtrusively, storming out of the farmhouse, and this was the first time I'd ever seen my husband looking so frayed at the edges, as if he hadn't had a wink of sleep. There were dark rings under his eyes. He looked far from happy. More to the point, he ignored me, which was incongruous behaviour for my loving husband. I ran hurriedly after him. "What's wrong, Jackson? You look like a bear with a sore head this morning. Has something bad happened?"
"I'm fine," he grumbled. "Just give me my space, will you?"
And I did. Jackson's account. I have never known the feeling of betrayal, as I opened up my wife's sock drawer. For some reason she was confusing her black socks with mine, and was always putting them in the wrong drawer. It was when I was removing my own socks that I saw a picture buried beneath the socks, and I knew at once I was looking at the ultrasound scan of my baby. Why had my wife not shown me the photograph? Shouldn't we share in all this together? I could feel my heart pounding with excitement. I remember Melanie showing me her first scan, and it had been a celebratory occasion for us. I had lost the love of my life and our baby to her peanut allergy. Melanie always carried an EpiPen with her, which she always kept in her purse. But she had so many purses, that was a big problem for me. I had tried to find her EpiPen, as I began scrambling my way through all her purses, but it was too late. The worst part of it all was I did find her EpiPen in a zip pocket in the first handbag that I'd opened, but I'd failed to see it. It was very hard not to blame myself for her death, as her EpiPen had been in her purse all along, and the emergency services could not get to my farmhouse in time. My wife had brought a cake from the baker's that they swore blind had no contamination with peanuts, but I was to find out that peanut oil had accidentally been used in the cake as an oversight. I now had a second chance with love when Harper had come along into my life. I had no intention of getting embroiled in a relationship, but it had happened, and our whirlwind romance meant we both couldn't wait to get married, and we did. I was a man who took things very slowly, one step at a time, but when Harper came along, we didn't waste any time in tying the knot in a private ceremony. When Harper announced she was pregnant, it was the quintessential icing on the cake for me. I was thrilled. I was going to be a father. For the first time in a long time, my life was finally looking up. I pulled out the ultrasound scan from the drawer, my heart thundering with excitement. As I studied the picture closely, this was my child. I was swilling with pride to see the evidence of the little baby growing inside my wife's womb. But it was when I turned the scan to the back that I saw the estimated due date of the baby's arrival, and that hit me like a cold blow to the face. No wonder my wife had hidden the scan from me. She didn't want me to know that I was not the baby's father. The printing on the back of the scan had given the game away. The fetus in my wife's womb was older than our own relationship. I felt so much anger towards my wife for her betrayal. She had clearly married me pregnant with somebody else's baby, and the hurt I felt coursed through me like a knife through the guts. It was a raw feeling. The wound hurt so hard and began to fester and become inflamed. I couldn't talk about it to my wife. It made the fact that she was having someone else's baby all the more real to me. I couldn't even bear to look at her, and she knew something was terribly wrong. I wondered if my wife even loved me, and all these painful thoughts swam into my mind like a school of hungry sharks, devouring all my hope and joy. I had hit rock bottom. I found myself in a place of such lonely desolation and despair. That night when we both lay in bed together, my wife reached out to touch me. "What's wrong, babe?" Is everything all right? Please talk to me. You've been so upset all day." I pulled away from her and said, "Nothing. I've just had a bit of a rough day, that's all." "Jackson, talk to me. How can I help you if you won't share your problem with me?" "Is it Melanie? Is it the anniversary of her death or something?"
"This is nothing to do with Melanie," I said brusquely. "Now let's get some sleep. I've got a busy day in the morning."
Of course I didn't get any sleep. I was experiencing my own dark night of the soul. I suspect it happens to all of us at some point in our lives. Losing Melanie had torn my life into shreds, but discovering my new wife was not carrying my baby was the final straw. I could not get my head past that revelation. It was a huge deal for me, not to be the father of my unborn baby. This was not fair. Had I not been through more than enough horrors in my lifetime? My mind kept taunting and teasing me. "The baby's not yours. The baby's not yours. The baby's not yours." And that was when I decided to take my rifle into the woodgrove and just blow my head off. It was a thought that came to my mind quickly, not a thought I had deliberated on. I'm sure many suicides are. On the contrary, it was an impulsive whim, a decision born about from a desire to evacuate my mind from the pain I was feeling, an end of my personal torment. I had been through too much. How much did the universe intend to take from me? I had nothing left to give. I was completely spent. Now I was expected to be a father to a boy that was not my own, and a husband to a woman who may not really even love me. Perhaps she had married me to offer her child financial security, which was why she had handed me her phone number in the diner, and had been enthusiastic to have a quick wedding, so that I'd never really gleam it had all been part of a strategic plan. Ending it all was an impulsive decision I made as quickly as the flavour of ice cream you choose at the ice cream parlour, without any earnest speculation. I tiptoed out of the house with my rifle and my torch in hand. My wife was lying fast asleep in bed, but I barely even gave her a second glance. I was so in love with her. I knew that one look at her beautiful face would subdue my desire to go through with my plan, and right now I saw it as the only escape from my pain. Shooting myself in the woodgrove would be a good place to end it all. It was my favourite spot on the entire property, and would spare my wife the grim aftermath of all that gruelling, indignant clean-up. It was so much neater to kill myself in the woodgrove, where nature would generously clean away the harrowing mess that I would naturally leave behind. I opened the door surreptitiously, and I was greeted to a beautiful, perfect evening. The clock on the kitchen wall had registered 12:34. There was a full moon hovering over the roof of the sky, like a miniature bright sun, with a luminescent glow and a soft, effusive light. It was almost as if the sponges on a car wash had bleached some of the darkness away, so that the sky, instead of being an inky black colour, was more like a deep pewter grey. I could see so many stars in the sky that night, bright constellations that twinkled brightly, like rhinestone jewels set in a glamorous evening gown. The orchestra of crickets and frogs serenaded the night, as I bounded down the path with the eagerness of a young child. Was I really looking that forward to meeting my end? What about my pregnant wife? What about my steers, my horses, my 2 Labradors that were sleeping in their baskets in the scullery and had barked abruptly when I'd left the house without them? But I knew my wife would not awaken from their barks. She could sleep through a tornado, if needs must, and being pregnant had made her permanently exhausted. My heart was pounding with an adrenaline rush as I finally entered the woodgrove. It was throbbing loudly in my ears. Even my hands were becoming soaked with my own sweat. I was wearing a headlamp on my head, and my feet were cushioned comfortably in my walking boots, while I carried my rifle in my hands. The ground seemed spongy beneath me as I padded through the red oak and chestnut trees, where their sculptural silhouettes had become dark and menacing, as only a faint scattering of pearly moonlight trespassed through the tight weave of the branches above my head. I'd never been in a woodgrove at night before, and it was oppressively inauspicious and bleak, like a dark drawing devoid of any light. I felt as if I was stumbling around in the darkness, as if there had been a major power cut in the woods, but the light of my headlamp was all that was needed to see my way ahead. Where was I going, I wondered? I hadn't even left a suicide note for my wife, but that couldn't be helped. I needed to get this over and done with before I chose to change my mind. My feet beat against the bracken of last year's fall, much that had become like a mulch beneath my feet. Finally I reached a tree that I'd always loved. It was one of my favourite trees in the entire wood grove. I believe it was 500 years old, and was a kind of tree that grounded me. It had magnificent sculptural branches and a powerful tree trunk which had been engraved by people whom had owned my ranch a long time ago. It had engravings on it. One of them said, "Polly and Dave forever." I slank down on the earthen floor, my back perching against the trunk of the tree. As I sat there, I put the gun against my forehead, and then wondered if it wouldn't be better to put it in my mouth. But before I could make any prompt decisions, something grabbed my rifle from me. Where had it gone? Who had taken it? And that was when I saw her, washed in the light of my headlamp. I was so dumbfounded by what I was perceiving that my mouth dropped wide open, and all thoughts about taking my life were overtaken by my complete bewilderment. I was staring at a Bigfoot. She was so strong, so majestic. She broke my rifle into pieces with her hands, bending the metal back so easily, as if it was nothing. She seemed to be shaking with anger, and I realized she was furious with me. As you can imagine, being in the presence of an angry Bigfoot with the strength of a farming tractor is not a pretty picture, but I wasn't afraid of this creature. Not at all. If she wanted to kill me, she was welcome to. She'd be doing me a favour. She'd save me the bother of having to kill myself, and that was a big plus. But this creature had no intention of killing me. She glared at me defiantly through her deep-set dark eyes, as if she was appalled and disgusted with me, as if I'd done something to cause her a grievous offence. I was amazed by how human her face was, and there was an intelligence about her that caught me way off guard. If things weren't weird enough, they were about to get significantly weirder. The creature spoke to me in an indigenous language that sounded as if it was rooted in ancient origins. Her words were translated into my head in English. "Italika! Italika! Italika!" I heard her say. "How dare you! How dare you! Italika!" She let out a low guttural growl. I stared at her through wide eyes. "Italika! Kikolopa! Isakana tua! Hisulukumaki safaka! O makalikunopa! Hilikoloshokwa! Sinakalabanakasi!" How dare you take your own life? It's not yours to take. Your life is a gift. You want to throw it away as if it means nothing. The trees only throw away their leaves when the weather is ripe for the fall. But you want to dispose of your body before it's due time. Have you no shame? What about your pregnant lady back home and your baby boy in the way? Don't you care about them? That was when I got angry with the Bigfoot. "What do you know about that? That baby is not mine. I'm not the real father." "Kikida poko, ha sakana kwaki, ho botono si, ha dalagana kwashika, ho mani tila nogobolona shi." But you will be his father, and from what I can see, you will be the father of 3 more boys still waiting to be born. And you're going to throw that all away for nothing at all, because you feel sorry for yourself. You know how pathetic that is. My people would call you gutless. I'm carrying my own baby in my womb, and this little thing is precious. So is your baby precious that is yet to be born, that was meant to be your child, even without the blood connection. Tokolanita, ha sakanakwo, ha minatolabani si. Now you get back home, do the right thing by your good lady, who loves you with all her heart, or you will have me to deal with. Antilaniko, ha sakanasi. And I can be very mean if I want to be. She shook her head in disgust and ambled away, and I realized in that moment she was absolutely right. I was pathetic. Why would I throw my life away over a baby that was not my own? Did it really matter in the grand scheme of things? When I told my wife how close I came to ending it all, she was completely devastated. We exchanged stories of the wild hairy lady in the woods whom had stopped me from doing something incredibly stupid. And 10 years down the line, I have 4 children, and dread to think what I would have missed out on if I'd blown the trigger. I haven't seen the Bigfoot again, but I have a feeling she'll show up when she's needed, like some kind of guardian angel. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.